Thank you so much. Wow, I'll put this up. Okay, there we go. So thank you all for coming. It's really exciting to be here. I appreciate you taking your time, and I'm really interested to hear, actually more interested to hear sort of what you have, what questions you have, and what you're interested in more than what I have to say. So I'm a consultant. I work globally on sustainability, mostly on policy and commitments with global companies, but also with some regional companies. Most of my clients are in Europe, North America, or Brazil. And I work across a number of industries, including pet, but also human food, leather, apparel, and just anything sort of on supply sourcing. So that's kind of my work. So I thought for today, we would just start by talking about sustainability in North America. So we'll talk a little bit about market and what's happening there. But mostly, I think it's really important. I'm going to guess that a lot of the suppliers here have been experiencing a lot of questions lately from their customers about economic and social impacts of your supply chain. You've been asked about traceability, you've been asked about certification. So I thought what I would do is just separate this by talking first about the regulations and the legislations that have come in recently that are significantly impacting the companies that I work with and changing their sustainability work. And then secondly, just about corporate sustainability work in general and what it is that they do. And we'll do a couple of recommendations and then we'll go have a drink. All right. So as you know, the pet industry itself is growing quite quickly globally. COVID had a massive impact in the US, Canada, and Europe. We know that 3/4 of the sales for the global pet food actually come out of North America and Europe, and that is actually growing as well. We know that is driven not only by the number of animals that are currently being kept, so increasing the number of pets, but also in the willingness of those owners to actually pay more. And what they want to pay more for are things that have sustainable attributes, and that's actually been a significant driver. So much so that we're expecting the annual growth rate to reach about 7%. The global projection is for 3.9%. So massive amounts of growth due to people being willing to spend money on it. We've seen a little bit of impact from inflation. So we've seen people sort of downgrade a little bit on some things, but actually pet consumers are less likely to downgrade on their pet products than they are on their own products. All right, so the consumer demand issues around sustainability are pretty consistent in most of the countries in which I work. And they really tend to be around sustainable ingredients, which may not be super significant for most of you, but it's really about how do we source animal proteins for pet food. That's really significant. And sort of the environmental social impacts of that. I would suggest if you have interested in that and how your customers might be dealing with it, I would refer you to the Pet Sustainability Coalition, which is a global coalition of companies that are addressing sustainability issues. And then, of course, second is the one that many of you will be interested in, which is plastics and packaging. There's really a big push in Canada, the US, and Europe right now. We'll talk about the legislation, but recycling is a bit of an issue, but certainly reusable and refillable options are starting to show up everywhere. All right, and I think it's really important because when we think about the consumers that we're selling to in those regions, they tend to be more environmentally conscious and more willing to pay for things than non-pet owners. It's actually quite significant, by about 5 to 6%, which when you think about the number of people is actually really a good news for you, for all of you. Whereas before we used to talk about sustainable or environmentally friendly products, what we're finding about most of these folks is they're really, really interested in not buying products, but buying from companies. So it's actually the brand itself that is more important for their sustainability story than the individual products. And that will be really significant if you're selling to companies, right? So they can't have a single product. If you have a brand that's really interested in sustainability and that's their branding, you can't have one or two products that are not sustainable anymore. We used to be able to sneak those things in, but now it has to be everything. The complexity to this, of course, is that 65% of those people actually say that they do not trust pet food or pet company sustainability claims. So even though I know a lot of companies are doing a lot of great work, we're not really doing it in a way that we're able to communicate it to the people that matter most. Okay, so the three things that are driving most of the work that I do and most of the work that the companies that you sell to or that you're producing for will really be on these three things. So obviously the consumer demand will always be everything. Compliance is great with legislation, but if nobody's buying stuff, it still doesn't help us. Secondly, legislation and regulation. I think probably you have a bunch of questions about that. And finally, we'll talk a little bit just about how the companies run their sustainability frameworks. So I think that the most important thing we're seeing right now are plastics. Anybody here dealing with plastics? Okay. So there's a lot of sort of two different approaches to this. So we generally tend to see regulation and legislation where we have not actually addressed issues in a really meaningful and effective way, right? So companies have been under complete pressure to deal with their plastic waste for the last 10 or 15 years. Recycling is not dealing with it, so governments are starting to step in. So if we had addressed this before, we wouldn't be here right now. But we know that there's a lot of work in the EU to be done on this. A lot of the work, so that's really just around exclusion from markets. A lot of the work being done is actually on making sure that the people that produce the plastic have a plan for it through to the end use, right? So if I produce plastic, I used to be responsible to it until it got to my customer. But now if I'm producing plastic, I'm responsible for it throughout its end life. I'm responsible to ensure that it doesn't get into a landfill, right? So that it doesn't become garbage. And so that's sort of, the United Nations are currently working on a treaty, plastics treaty. South Korea, November of this year, we will see the final document from that. And we don't know exactly what it looks like, but expect a 3 to 5 year phase in on that. And it will be something to do with extended producer responsibility. And we're seeing a lot of countries actually starting to prepare for this. So Canada, where I'm from, just about a month and a half ago, completed a set of regulations that require everybody that import or produce plastic to actually register it and then follow it through to its end use to make sure that it's not just being thrown away. And that really will sort of drive that for them. The second one that I'm sure some of you are dealing with right now, especially anybody deal with leather or rubber or paper or wood, the EU deforestation regulations are a bit of a mess, but they're going to be really significant. Their goal is to exclude any products that are associated with deforestation. And they do that by prohibiting the import and the sale. So you can't bring those into the EU right now. So the requirement is that the people that are bringing it in, the people who will be selling it, your customers in Europe, will actually be able to do a due diligence process, and we'll talk through what that is, to ensure that they're at a low risk for impacting deforestation, right? So we know that a lot of the wood, a lot of the beef coming out of somewhere like Brazil is being raised or grown on land that used to be part of the Amazon rainforest, but has now been burnt down, or it's being exploited beyond its capacity to regrow. So it's really addressing that sort of thing. Okay, so that's sort of the idea of legislation, right? So we see legislation when we don't do the things that we're supposed to do. When we don't address things, governments will come and actually do legislation. Corporate sustainability policies are ways to try to avoid that, right? So what it does is it integrates the environmental and social issues, and we'll talk about what those are, into the broader sustainability, right? So the old way of thinking was that companies' jobs were to provide shareholder value, but now we talk about stakeholder value. We want to make sure that companies are having positive impacts, they're reducing their negative impacts, but also having positive impacts for the people that they impact, for the areas and for the environments that they impact, right? So just a new way of thinking about it. Okay, a couple things you're going to hear a lot about are impacts, which are the effects that a business will have. And what's interesting here too is it used to be just only within our own four walls, right? I don't know, none of you look old enough to have done this, but like 15 years ago, I worked at a grocery chain, and everything we did was on sustainability was changing light bulbs. We were really interested in things inside our own business. The focus now is on the entire supply chain. So if I'm a company selling pet products in Europe, I'm interested all the way back to where that was raised or grown or harvested or whatever happened to it. Material impacts are those impacts that will have a future financial impact. And we're really interested in explaining double materiality, which means we're interested in saying, this is the impact we have on, for example, climate change, but also this is the impact that climate change has on us, right? So we know that some of the trees that we use to harvest are, when we're increasing our GHG emissions, that's causing climate change. So that's not a good thing. But we also know that that climate change is reducing the grow rate of those trees, and that's going to negatively impact our business in the future, right? So we want to understand not only what impact we're having, but also what that impact will then have on our business in the future. All right. So this is just a suggestion for those of you who are interested in understanding what. I know sometimes these issues come and they seem to come out of nowhere. Because companies operate globally and they operate in different regions, there's sort of no global requirement for sustainability. But we use reporting frameworks. There are a bunch of them. There's just a bunch of letters, so I'm not going to tell you who they all are. But I would recommend you just, if you're interested, to look at the Global Reporting Initiative, because it's actually the most used, so 100,000 companies use it to report. And what that will do is tell you what the issues that they're looking at, and they're going to tell you how they actually assess those impacts, right? What's important to them, what's not important to them. Because if what we said before, which is that the regulation and legislation really determines your impact into a market, so into a country, the sustainability frameworks will really sort of dictate if you get into companies, right? So same thing, it's just their sort of legislation. Okay, so just going to run the process for you. This is in simplified Chinese and a variety of languages, so it should be easy if you're interested in it. So this is the process that I will take my clients through when we're developing this. It's based on the OECD, and it's just a due diligence process. You would have seen that in the slide on the EUDR, and it's also part of the ESRS. As a company, I need to do this as part of my reporting. That's what the European sustainability thing requires now. And that's why they're going to be calling you up and saying, hey, tell me about the living wages and quality of life of your workers and the workers in your supply chain, because they need to report that now. Okay, so first thing we do is we set a policy statement. That policy statement says, we as an organization believe the following things, right? So this is your goals and your ambitions for the long term. It's based on your corporate values and where you work, and also sort of your place in the market. So you would say things like, we're committed to ensuring good quality of life and economic well-being for our workers and for people we impact. So that's the first thing to do. Second thing you do is identify the actual and potential impacts. in your operation, so in your own business, but also in your supply chains, and any sort of business relationships. So that includes contractors, subcontractors, really complex for some of you with your supply chains. Like, just, it can get really complex. And we'll talk later. So the GRI will actually have a list of those by sector. So I would suggest you just look at those. Third thing we're going to do is we're going to set short-term commitments that are going to make sure we get to those policies, right? We want to ensure good quality of life for the people that work for us, so we're going to make commitments to ensure that that's what they're going to get to. I want to be clear that you're not expected to do everything all at the same time. You're going to have to prioritize. And so it's a continuous improvement process. It's not a light switch, right? And so just don't feel like you need to do everything at the same time. The GRI gives you what's called a materiality assessment, which allows you to sort of prioritize and process which ones you should do first. Fourth thing we do is track implementation and results. So we obviously want to ensure that the work that we're doing is actually having the impact that we want it to. I mean, we all have projects where the outcome was exactly the opposite of what we wanted, and that's totally fine. We can do that, but we don't want to do that forever. So we want to make sure that we are actually going to be managing that. Fifth, then, is you want to communicate these things. So part of this is about managing risk. It's about being clear. It's communicating to your customers, to your suppliers, to investors if you're a publicly traded company. And it's really good practice to talk about not only the things you did well, but the things you might have problems with, right? So you can go online right now, think about your biggest your biggest customer. If they're either publicly traded or they're of a significant size, they're likely going to have a social responsibility report up. And that will tell you what matters to them. And I would focus on those things first because that's what your customers want. I would focus on those first. You're going to do this every year. They review and update, and that's a bit of a project. The policy side itself, if these are based on your values, they won't change very often. So they will stay the same. Okay, so the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, we spoke about this a lot. It's a really big deal because it's a requirement for 40,000 companies that are based in the EU. So everybody on the stock exchange plus, I think it's 150 million euros and 2,500 employees-ish. So it's for larger companies. And then also 10,000 non-European countries, which is really interesting. So if you are not domiciled in the EU, but you do substantial work in there, you actually are subject to this as well. So the next step is that by 2026, those 50,000 will need to assess and report on their impact. So they'll need to do that due diligence process that we just spoke with. So here's a little cheat sheet for you. This is the impacts that are most relevant to the ESRS. Therefore, if you have large companies, these are going to be the ones that are most relevant to you. Again, ask them what's important and what matters. Some of these may seem sort of like things you're not interested, that are going to be really difficult to do. But remember, this is just about whether you can maintain access to your current customer base, or if you want to grow your customer base. These are the things you're looking for if you're going to Europe. We're also starting to see European companies talk about this with their, so a European company that's a global company that also has North American operations are sometimes looking to do it there as well. So I think the impacts are going to be a bit bigger than we thought they were going to be. Okay, so I'm just going to close this real quickly. So look, three things that I think would really help you all out. These are big, complex issues, and they probably require more resources and time than you have individually to actually deal with them. I would say the first thing you want to do is talk to your big customers about sort of what they see their sustainability work will be in the next 3 to 5 years. Ask them what matters, ask them what they report to, find out what matters to them, right? They're the people that matter to you the most. And also your largest customers are probably also aligned with their other customers, with their peer companies. So you're actually, it's just a good indication of what's going on. Secondly, engage with your suppliers and any relevant stakeholders. So you will be responsible for the impacts in your own supply chain, which is a little bit different from what some of us have been used to, right? So we want to be traceable, we want to be credible, we want to be coherent, we want to be able to do all that. So do that. This work is being done by a lot, or will need to be done by a lot of different organizations. So just use what's out there. Don't feel like you need to do it by yourself. I'd also suggest maybe your friends at Global Sources can help you out, but there's a real opportunity for you as an industry to sort of engage this together, like in a single working group. So I sit on a sustainable agriculture working group in Brazil that's doing this currently, and then one that's global for global food companies, has 17 of the largest food companies in the world, based out of the UK. So you have a lot of things in common with your peers, a lot of things in common with your suppliers, and a lot of things in common with your customers. You exploit those relationships as much as you can. You might want to take a look at a due diligence process for your own business. So go through that process, as I mentioned. You'll learn a lot of stuff, and not all things you want to know. And then finally, just focus on building transparency and credibility. If you look at all the things that have been asked by consumers, by regulations, legislation, and by the sustainability reporting standards, it's really about traceability, transparency, and impact, right? So start building that now. Make sure that you can trace your supply chains back as far as you can go. And also, you might want to think of a supplier code of conduct to help sort of address some of the social issues. And I would recommend that you look at the Pet Sustainability Coalition, which has a template for that for free. And I'm going to stop there and ask if there are any questions. And they don't have to be in English.
Hello， 大家好，我将对今天 Darren 的演讲做一个简短的翻译。Darren 是我们来自加拿大宠物行业的一名专家，是我们本届展会合作的协会美国的 PSC 推荐来的嘉宾。他今天提到了我们昨天先去展商那边收集了一些大家在进出口贸易，尤其是宠物行业内遇到了一些困境。然后 Darren 今天提到了，就是说我们展商在出口到欧盟以及北美市场，欧盟市场对于宠物类的产品，尤其是橡胶材质，它的要求会比较严格。然后刚才 Darren 也举例给出了OECD 这些就是北美以及欧盟市场他们的一些标准。在出口方面呢，这两个市场比较强调供应链，尤其是材料的这个来源的追溯。Darren 今天也给出了相应的建议和方案。如果大家有什么问题，欢迎大家提问，或者通过邮箱发送给我们，我们会一一解答。谢谢大家。